Hi, everybody, and thanks for being here. It's always exciting to see all the work that you guys are producing because that enables me to think how I can leverage all of the work that you guys are doing and the things that we're building and communicating both at the Dangerman Preserve, but also across this larger nexus. So today I'll be talking about a few things related to geospatial decision support tools that we're creating to help us manage smarter on the Dangerman Preserve and think about how these management strategies can lead to novel and new science opportunities. So Heather stole my line this morning by saying that, conservation previously was this thing that you put a fence around something and you walk away saying that the work is done. The work is done, we preserve this landscape. Obviously, we need to move much further beyond that concept. And really, this is the point in which a lot of the work begins. So we start to think of nature preservation as really this active landscape. It's not passive anymore. And the preserve and protected areas really are these platforms in which are the key to unlocking everything that we all sit in this room and try and think about and then do. In 2014, I think you guys have maybe seen this report if you work in anything related to field stations or reserve science out there. It was a really great report that sort of took the survey of all the field stations across the globe and tried to think strategically of what the roadmap was to push these things into the 21st century. What's the finance models around these places? What are sort of the collaborative models in science in these places? What are sort of the data models that we might think through? But they also called out to be in the 21st century, you need internet and you need data. And that was a big finding in 2014. These places need internet to do and be collaborative. They need internet to find finances and resources and new networks and new partnerships. And I think that there's obviously an update needed. This is 10 years ago, right? So this is a decade-old report. What's the new 21st century preserve? What are the resources we need to start thinking about? It moves beyond just having internet and getting data. It's starting to think about what are these interconnections that we can make. So there was this great paper that came out last year that really talked about why field stations in these places that we hold near to dear are important. And they're important literally just by being. This report looked at a remote sensing analysis that took into consideration field stations and looked at landscapes near and around it, and basically said that places that there were field stations, they were conserving biodiversity and there was a lot less land cover change in and around those. So, but just by being field stations, they protect places, they protect biodiversity, but they also support people. They support the staff and jobs and livelihoods, and they also support and leverage research that we're talking about. So we know they're really important, and there's a lot of them across the globe. There's a cool web map that you can go and see all of these different field stations across the globe and what their focus areas are. And in our little neck of the woods, we have kind of these bookends of North County, Santa Barbara, in the Dangerman Preserve and in Sedgwick Reserve. And these, in many ways, are sort of like the best in class examples of research and field station opportunities, both within the Nature Conservancy and within the UCNRS. So, but they're also, with the funding regime that we've all been talking about and everything going on, they are still at risk of like, how do we use scarce resources going forward? How do we start to collaborate more generally with each other to solve these what seemingly insurmountable problems that we're facing right now? And my argument for what do we need to do that and to do that most effectively, efficiently with the little resources we have is to use all the data that you guys are generating and create these geospatial data-driven decision support tools to help us manage the landscapes and have these kind of constant feedback loops between science-informed management and how that makes these preserves feel and do more work in a larger landscape setting. So at the Dangerman Preserve, we've been thinking about these in strategic areas that our stewardship team, our restoration team, and other folks are tackling on the preserve with very specific problems in mind. How do we use geospatial data to solve these very specific issues across each one of these things? So we've been talking about fire, so I'm going to talk more about fire. And then I'll also talk a little bit about freshwater. But this idea of how do we do more with less? How do we prioritize and find efficiencies around these things? So to set up the story a little bit, I'm going to talk about water first, but this is going to be a story about freshwater and fire interactions and how what started as a concept of us building a decision support tool to help us manage these resources on site really turned into a novel research project that I'll talk about last, that has critical insights for how we're thinking about and managing fire and freshwater in the county. So the freshwater problem was two-pronged. Gophers and Scott DeShecco is how we'll throw this at you. So there's this problem. We have a ton of gophers at the Dangerman Preserve. They would chew through major pipelines in our water infrastructure and drain up to 70,000 gallons of water within a day, and no one would know. And it was this problem of, it's a very simple monitoring problem, right? Like, how do we create the technical solutions to help us react quicker and know when a gopher chews through the line, send somebody immediately out to fix things? So that was the gopher problem. But we also thought we could leverage the same sort of solution kit or tools that we were using to help us manage our water resources to ask more nuanced questions about what does groundwater recharge look like in these territories using kind of the same set of instrumentation. So for the water tanks, we put these little sensors out and adapted them so that they would tell you when water levels dropped immediately and send a text message out to our staff to immediately start to do the things. So it's the same technology that now we've deployed in partnership with the DeShecco Lab and Allison, who's deployed 90% of these devices to actually look at groundwater levels, pair those with precipitation gauge, and get live streaming groundwater recharge information for the preserve. So all of this data is publicly available for folks to use, and we're starting to use those to better manage our resources on site. Think about how we are modeling those both hindcasting and into the future to look at water balance and water budgets across the preserve, and then also integrate those into our restoration decisions on site, thinking about steelhead. Do we have enough water available in our streams at certain periods of time using data sets like this? We're also growing this. So what started as just a measly sensor on a tank telling you how much water is in it is now a technology that we're adapting and spreading across TNC preserves. We've instrumented now 6 additional TNC sites, and we're trying to work with the DeShecco Lab to create the first ever California groundwater recharge observatory, where we can understand more what our water looks like underneath our feet and how quickly it moves and is more dynamic. And then on the fire side, I'll breeze through this fairly quickly because Sophia has a virtual poster later on that you can talk to her all about the fire tools that we're building. But similar to the water problem, these were very specific questions that we had about where to put prescribed fire on the Dangerman Preserve. And then because we're doing a lot of prescribed fire work, as you've seen with the lake fire, on follows a ton of research. How do you start to coordinate all that research so that we're getting that feedback loop from research to understanding back into management practices? So how do we bring all that stuff together? So we've been doing sort of a 4-pronged approach to all of this. Sophia has been a big lead on this, and she can walk through this prescribed fire data-driven support tool, but then basically it's a suitability model that will help you start to think through all of the different layers that you might want to combine to target certain outcomes for prescribed fire on the Dangerman Preserve. We're aggregating a lot of the experimental data that people are collecting and pulling that into one sort of one-stop shop so people can see what the overlap is between projects and start to look through deep temporal time series of what people are collecting. We're throwing that into communications around story maps, letting our community know that we're burning and we're burning for these reasons, and they have access to the data if they want to look at it. And then we're also doing what a lot of you guys have talked about today, is trying to pair field-based experiments to remote sensing indices and try to say from remote sensing, can we tell if we're meeting the burn objectives that we set out to light this landscape on fire to meet in the first place? So that's in the bottom corner, the Army camp area that we burned in conjunction with the fall treks and some of the 1 month, 2 month outcomes of what some of these indices look like. So those two sort of like management toolkits really led us to this idea of how do we think about water and fire? And Lee talked a lot about the plant physiology. This is not plant physiology. It's really focusing on groundwater. How does groundwater start to interact through like this lens of plant physiology and feed into fire? And so we worked with NASA and Dr. Masa Kouadi, who was basically a postdoc with us in the last 2 years. She's now at the Carey Institute, and really thought about, okay, fire models throughout the state don't often incorporate hydrological variables that are underneath your first level layers of soil moisture. How do you start to think about incorporating groundwater and groundwater recharge in short-term and long-term dynamics into a model that sort of addresses this at the state scale? So she did a ton of modeling using mainly the basin characterization model, but really focusing on the hydrological variables and bringing those into a model that we could start to look at fire risk across the Santa Barbara County, and then use that really nuanced fire risk model to actually think about our prescribed fire planning and integrate that. So we developed a 270-meter wildfire probability map for Santa Barbara County, but we also were able to sort of like rank feature importance of how impactful some of these short-term and long-term hydrologic variables were in predicting fire. And for the first time ever, sort of suggested that a deviation in groundwater recharge has a really driving effect on wildfire modeled probability throughout the state. This is sort of like first time that people are thinking about these groundwater fire interconnections. And so we're using this and this new term that came out about hydroclimatic whiplash. I think it's a really interesting thing where basically you have really wet years and then a ton of vegetation growth and then big potential for fire behavior and sort of this whiplash style behavior. So it's sort of these management problems, right, that are leading to these new and novel integrative ideas in science. And so across all of these systems, we've been thinking about how we start with these really simple questions that often have simple technical solutions, but I think that they're really powerful and important to how we're driving kind of these real world problems that are only found because of our deep embeddedness in these landscapes and the management and sort of the co-design with often management and science hand in hand that happen at these places where you're managing a field station or a preserve. So what do 21st century preserves need? They need a lot more of these types of solutions that sort of reduce our inefficiencies in how we're managing it, help us make better decisions faster, using less resources, and do that more collaboratively. So I'd love to talk more. Oh, do I still have 1 minute? Should I keep talking? No, okay. So please reach out to us